The map may show a clear path, a dotted line leading to your destination, but sometimes the world has other plans. Sometimes the road doesn't just end. It changes. Twists, it turns, it beckons you down routes you never intended to take. Tonight, we journey into those places, the forgotten stretches and the dark corners, where the familiar gives way to something far more unsettling. Turn off the lights, put your headphones on, and let the outside world fade away. Let's explore the roads that lead to nowhere good. Welcome back to Scareverse. The faded green sign at the edge of town always said NO Outlet for County Road 13. But I swear that morning it looked like someone had painted over NO Outlet with a crude, hand-painted private. I was 19, home for the summer from my first year of college, and restless. My grandparents lived deep in the foothills, a place where cell service died 10 miles before you even got close. I knew those roads like the back of my hand, every curve, every dip. I'd driven CR 13 hundreds of times. It was a narrow, gravel lane that dead-ended at the old Johnson farm, now abandoned and overgrown. A perfect place for some quiet time or maybe just to think. The change on the sign was so subtle, so easily dismissed, that I barely registered it beyond a flicker of annoyance. My plan for the day was simple. Take my grandfather's beat-up old Ford Ranger, drive out to the Johnson place, and spend a few hours sketching in my notebook. I was an art major, and the crumbling barn and dense woods always provided good inspiration. The truck rattled and groaned, kicking up dust as I turned onto Sur 13. The sun was high, dappling through the canopy of old oaks and pines. Felt peaceful, like any other summer day. I passed the usual landmarks. The leaning mailbox that used to belong to the Millers, the huge oak with the lightning strike scar, the small stream where the gravel often washed out a bit after a heavy rain. Everything seemed exactly as it should be, pushing that private sign out of my mind. About halfway to the Johnson farm, where the road usually made a sharp left around a particularly dense thicket, I noticed something new. A barely visible track, almost completely swallowed by weeds and young saplings, veered off to the right. It wasn't a road. It was more like a deer trail that had been widened just enough for a single vehicle, maybe. I'd never seen it before, and I'd been coming out here since I was a kid. Curiosity got the better of me. The Johnson farm could wait. I shifted the Ranger into a lower gear and slowly, carefully, turned off the main gravel road, the underbrush scraping against the truck's sides. It felt like I was trespassing, but there was no sign, no fence, just an unspoken invitation into the unknown. The track quickly narrowed, and the tree cover became so thick that the sunlight barely pierced through. It was much cooler back here, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. After what felt like 10 minutes of bumping along, the path opened slightly onto a small, unexpected clearing. In the center stood a tiny, dilapidated shack. Not a cabin, not even really a house, but a shack made of rough, unpainted planks, with a corrugated metal roof that was mostly rust. There were no windows, just dark, empty openings that looked like they'd been cut with an axe. A faint, acrid smell hung in the air, something like burnt sugar and old oil, and a shiver ran down my spine despite the warmth of the summer day. This was beyond the end of any map I knew. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the buzzing of unseen insects. The shack was unsettling. It had no porch, no path leading up to it, just a single heavy wooden door. It looked less like a place people lived and more like something that had just appeared there. Deep in the woods, forgotten and intentionally hidden. There was a rusted metal drum near the door, and what looked like a pile of ashes beside it. My heart started to thump a little harder. This wasn't just an abandoned structure. It felt like a warning. Every instinct told me to turn around, to get back in the truck and forget I'd ever seen this place. But something held me there, a morbid fascination with the forbidden. As I sat there, Eyes glued to the dark doorway, a sound drifted from inside the shack. It was faint, barely audible over the ringing in my ears, but distinct. A low, rhythmic thudding, like something heavy being dropped, or maybe someone pounding on a thick piece of wood. It wasn't regular enough to be a machine, and it wasn't loud enough to be an animal. It sounded deliberate, almost purposeful. My breath caught in my throat. I was alone, miles from anywhere, and whatever was making that sound was inside that shack. The hair on my arms stood on end. I remembered my grandfather's stern warnings about respecting the land, about some folks who lived off the grid and didn't take kindly to visitors. This wasn't just a deserted building. Despite the primal fear urging me to flee, a foolish part of me felt compelled to see what was making that noise. I slowly, quietly, opened the truck door, the creak sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. I moved like a phantom, stepping lightly over the dried leaves and twigs, trying not to make a sound. The acrid smell was stronger now. I reached the shack's door, which was surprisingly heavy and made of rough-hewn planks. There was no knob, just a rusted metal latch. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for it. The thudding stopped. The sudden silence was even more terrifying than the sound itself. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing, just my own ragged breathing. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed the latch and pulled the door inward. It groaned on rusty hinges, revealing an interior that was almost completely dark, even with the midday sun outside. My eyes struggled to adjust. The shack was small, just one room, dirt floor, and utterly empty. No furniture, no tools, nothing but a few scattered, dried leaves that had blown in. And at the far end, in the corner, was a perfectly circular patch of darker, damp earth. It looked like something had recently been dug up or buried. The acrid smell was strongest here, clinging to the air. My heart hammered. There was no one. Nothing was there. But the thudding sound had been real, and the smell was undeniable. The emptiness was more frightening than any monster. I backed out slowly, carefully, pulling the door shut behind me, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing in the clearing. I didn't run. Couldn't. My legs felt like lead. As I walked back to the truck, I had an overwhelming sensation of being watched. Not from the shack, but from the dense woods that surrounded the clearing. Every shadow seemed to hold eyes. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. I scrambled into the Ranger, fumbling with the keys, and started the engine. The roar of the old truck was a comfort, but the feeling of unseen eyes persisted. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I pulled away, but all I saw was the fading outline of the shack, swallowed by the trees and the dark, silent forest. I drove fast, not caring about the bumps or the scraping branches, until I was back on County Road 13. The familiar gravel felt like salvation under the tires. I didn't stop at the Johnson farm. I just kept driving all the way back to my grandparents' house. I never told them what I saw. I didn't even try to rationalize it. The private sign, the hidden track, the empty shack, the rhythmic thudding that stopped when I opened the door, the circular patch of damp earth, and that chilling sensation of being watched, it all coalesced into something deeply wrong. I haven't been back down Sierra 13 since, not even to visit the Johnson farm. The map might end there, but some things live past the end of the map, and they definitely don't want visitors. Now, whenever I drive past any faded NO outlet sign, I find myself checking for hidden paint, for any subtle alteration. I check the woods too, for any hint of a barely visible track disappearing into the trees. It's been years, but the memory still sits heavy, a cold knot in my stomach. What was that sound? What was buried or dug up in that dirt floor? And who was watching me from the shadows? I have no answers, just the chilling certainty that some places are meant to stay hidden, and some roads are meant to dead end, because beyond them, There are things we're never meant to find, and people who will make sure we never do. It's easy to dismiss what we can't see, to believe that simply turning around will erase the memory of a wrong turn. But some paths leave a residue, a faint whisper that clings to you long after you've left them behind. And sometimes, the echo of one journey can lead you straight into another. The old wooden signpost for Miller's Creek, splintered and peeling, was gone. Not knocked over, not even broken, just vanished. I noticed it immediately because that sign marked the turnoff, the real start of nowhere, and I'd been driving that route every other weekend for the past year to visit my grandparents. They lived way out in the sticks, deep into the Appalachian foothills, a good hour past where cell service died, and a good 20 minutes past the last gas station. I was 22 then, a college student, and the drive was usually a peaceful escape from campus life, a chance to clear my head. This time, though, seeing that empty spot where the sign used to be, a tiny shiver went down my spine. It was just a sign, but it was a familiar landmark, and its absence felt heavy. I slowed down, wondering if I'd somehow missed my turn. But no, the narrow dirt track leading into the woods was definitely the same one. It snaked past dense thickets of pine and oak, barely wide enough for one car, with branches scraping against the sides if you weren't careful. What was different, though, were the trees, or rather, the density of them. It felt like the forest had grown inward, encroaching on the path more than usual. Some of the saplings looked like they'd just sprung up, small and green, right on the edge of the road, almost forcing me to drive even slower. It was odd, like nature was reclaiming the space with a sudden, aggressive burst of growth. I figured maybe the county hadn't done their usual maintenance work this year, letting things get a little wilder. Another 10 minutes passed, and I started feeling increasingly uneasy. Usually, by this point, I'd pass a few scattered mailboxes, leaning precariously on crooked posts, serving the 3 or 4 other isolated cabins even deeper than my grandparents' place. Today, there were none, just endless trees pressing in from both sides. The silence was also unnerving. No birdsong, no rustling leaves from squirrels, just the low hum of my engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under my tires. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the mailboxes had just fallen down, or maybe I was driving a little faster than usual and hadn't noticed them. But the feeling that something was off wouldn't shake. It was too quiet, too still. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. Then I saw it. The clearing where my grandparents' small, sturdy cabin should have been. But it wasn't their cabin. This one was smaller, more dilapidated, with rotting porch boards and a single boarded-up window. The paint, if it ever had any, was long gone, leaving weathered, gray wood. A rusted, skeletal swing set stood in the overgrown yard, slowly being swallowed by weeds. My stomach dropped. I knew this wasn't right. I'd driven this road countless times. I knew every bend, every dip, every tree that looked like a monster in the fading light. This wasn't their place. It wasn't even one of the other cabins I sometimes saw. This place felt ancient, forgotten, like it had been sitting there for 100 years, waiting. I slammed on the brakes, my tires kicking up a cloud of dust. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the decaying structure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I taken the wrong road after all? But that was impossible. There was only one turnoff from the main road that led this far back. My hands were shaking as I put the car in reverse, slowly backing up until I found a spot wide enough to attempt a 3-point turn. Every movement felt agonizingly slow, and I kept glancing at the cabin, half expecting to see a shadow move in one of the dark openings. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I just needed to get out of there. As I started driving back the way I came, a new sound began. A low, rhythmic thumping, almost like a heartbeat, but too deep, too slow to be my own. It seemed to come from the trees, from everywhere at once, a soft, persistent pulse against the silence. It wasn't loud, not at all, but it was constant, and it burrowed into my ears, making my teeth ache. I tried to focus on the road, on the fading light, on anything but that sound. I sped up, wanting to outrun it, but the thumping seemed to keep pace, a constant reminder that I was still deep in those woods. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just a wrong turn anymore. This was something else entirely, something deliberately wrong. I drove for what felt like an eternity, my eyes scanning for any familiar landmark, for the missing sign, for anything that would tell me I was heading in the right direction. But the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees a solid, unyielding wall on either side. There was no sign of the main road, no glimpse of open sky, just the oppressive canopy above, filtering the last rays of daylight into a murky twilight. And that thumping continued, growing subtly louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making it was drawing closer. I checked my phone, knowing it was futile, but hoping for some miracle of a signal. Of course, nothing. Just the grim no-service icon staring back at me from the screen. Panic was starting to claw its way up my throat. Finally, the road opened into a small clearing, bathed in the pale, eerie light of the rising moon. In the center, there was a crude fire pit, still smoking faintly, and around it, a dozen figures stood. They were dressed in dark, plain clothing, almost like old-fashioned work clothes, and they were all facing inward, their backs to me. They weren't moving, just standing perfectly still like statues. The thumping sound was loudest here, coming from the center of their circle, a deep, resonant thump-thump-thump. I couldn't see what they were gathered around, but the air was thick with a strange, earthy smell, like damp soil and something else, something vaguely metallic. I killed my headlights, hoping they hadn't seen me, and let my car coast to a silent stop at the edge of the clearing. One of the figures, the tallest one, slowly turned its head. It didn't turn its body, just its head, at an angle that looked unnatural. Even in the dim light, I could feel its gaze on me, a deep, unsettling intensity. I couldn't make out any features, just the dark outline of a face, but I knew it was staring directly into my car, directly at me. The thumping stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I sat there, frozen, barely breathing, convinced that if I moved, if I even twitched, something terrible would happen. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned its head back to face the center of the circle. The thumping resumed, soft at first, then growing in intensity. I didn't wait. I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and peeled out of there, leaving the clearing and those silent, staring figures behind me as fast as I possibly could. I don't remember much of the drive back, just a blur of dark trees and the constant, nagging fear that I was going in circles. But eventually, miraculously, I saw it. The familiar, freshly painted sign for Miller's Creek, standing right where it always had been, bright white against the dark foliage. I slammed on the brakes, relief washing over me, then pulled onto the main highway, my hands still shaking violently. I never went back to my grandparents' house after that. I called them from the next town over, making up an excuse about car trouble, and they sounded perfectly normal, complaining about the heat, asking when I'd visit again. But I couldn't. I just couldn't. I'd driven the road to nowhere, and I knew what lived past the end of the map. They're still out there, waiting. You might think you've escaped the last dead end, found your way back to solid ground. But the mind has a way of holding onto the edges, the lingering unease that suggests you were never truly out of danger. The world keeps moving, and sometimes the next unsettling stop is just around the bend. The GPS said turn left, but there was no left. Just a gap in the trees, barely wide enough for my beat-up sedan, with no road sign or anything. I remember thinking it was exactly the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't actively looking for it, or if you actually expected a real road. It was late afternoon, August, and the sun was starting to dip behind the taller pines, casting long, strange shadows that made the whole woods feel a lot deeper than they probably were. I was headed to visit my cousin, Mark, who had bought some land way out in what he called the real country, which, translated, meant where the pavement ended and cell service died. He'd given me vague directions, mostly just telling me to keep going until you can't go anymore, which, in hindsight, was a pretty ominous instruction. My own place was a standard suburban house in Ohio, the kind with a neat lawn and friendly neighbors. Mark, on the other hand, had moved to this corner of West Virginia where property was cheap and people were, well, different. After bumping along that unpaved track for what felt like forever, the trees finally opened up a little. That's when I saw it. Not Mark's place, but another house, much older, set back from the dirt path. It wasn't just old. It was like the woods were actively trying to reclaim it. Overgrown bushes hugged the porch, and what looked like a satellite dish was half fallen off the roof. There was an old, faded pickup truck parked out front, covered in a fine layer of dust, like it hadn't moved in years. No lights were on and no smoke from the chimney, but there was something about it that made me slow down, a sense of quiet observation. As I drove past, maybe doing 10 miles an hour, I glanced towards the house. The windows were dark, reflecting the dense woods like black mirrors. But then, just for a split second, I caught something in one of the upstairs windows, a quick, bright glint, like light catching off glass, maybe a pair of binoculars or a camera lens. It was so fast, so fleeting, that I immediately dismissed it. Probably just the sun hitting something inside, some forgotten knick-knack. Or maybe my imagination, hyped up by the isolation and the growing twilight. I told myself it was nothing, just my city brain being jumpy in the wilderness. I sped up a little, eager to get to Mark's, to a place where I knew I was expected and welcomed. The woods closed in again behind the house, making it feel even more cut off from everything. Mark's cabin was another 15 minutes down the increasingly narrow track. It was exactly what you'd expect. Log construction, a wide porch, and a fire pit already laid. He was out there, waving, a big grin on his face. We spent the evening catching up, grilling some burgers and sitting by the fire, talking about how different life was out here. He loved the quiet, the lack of immediate neighbors. He knew about the old house I'd passed, said it had been empty for as long as he'd known, but that he'd heard some stories. Nothing specific, just vague warnings from locals about keeping your distance. I mentioned the glint, half-jokingly, and he just shrugged it off, said it was probably just the wind rattling something. He never seemed bothered by the isolation or the rumors. He was a live and let live kind of guy, even with phantom neighbors. I woke up in the middle of the night not to a sound, but to the absence of sound. Mark's generator, which usually hummed steadily in the background, had cut out. The cabin was suddenly pitch black and utterly silent. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to find my way to the bathroom. As I was heading back to bed, a strange impulse made me go to the front window. Peeking through the gap in the curtains, I could see the narrow dirt path, illuminated faintly by the moon. And then I saw it again. Two small, faint lights, far down the track, almost swallowed by the darkness. They were definitely headlights, but they weren't moving. Just stationary, like a car was parked there way out past Mark's property line, near where I knew that other house was situated. My heart started to beat a little faster. I watched those distant lights for what felt like an eternity. They didn't move. No engine sound, no flicker, just a steady, unblinking glow in the absolute darkness. It was unsettling. Who would be parked out there in the dead of night in the middle of nowhere? Mark had said he was the last house on this particular stretch. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone broke down or was just stargazing. But deep down, it felt wrong. Felt like waiting. After about 20 minutes, with my eyes straining in the dark, the lights finally switched off, plunging that part of the woods into complete blackness. I kept watching for another 10 minutes, but nothing. No sound, no movement, just the oppressive quiet of the deep woods. I finally went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. The next morning, the generator was running again, and Mark was oblivious. He asked if I'd slept well, and I just mumbled something about getting used to the quiet. I didn't mention the lights. Felt too silly, too deniable. We had breakfast, and then I decided it was time to head back to civilization. As I was pulling out of Mark's driveway, I looked down the road towards where the other house was. And there, parked right by the entrance to that overgrown driveway, was the faded pickup truck. The same one I'd seen yesterday. But this time, it was facing the other direction, pointing back towards Mark's cabin, as if it had driven past us sometime in the night. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, just enough to catch the light, and a small, dirty rag hung from the rearview mirror. It was such a small detail, but it hit me hard. It hadn't been there the day before, facing that way with the door ajar. It had been parked facing the cabin. Someone had moved it. My mind started piecing things together. The glint in the window, the headlights parked down the road, and now the truck, facing my direction. It was like they were watching, waiting. The whole time I'd been at Mark's, someone had been aware. And the truck was now angled as if it had followed the car that parked its headlights down the road. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. As I drove past the house again, slower this time, I couldn't help but look up at that same upstairs window. And in the dark pane, I saw it, unmistakable this time. A face. Not clearly defined, just a pale oval in the gloom, barely visible but definitely there, staring directly at my car. It wasn't a reflection of anything. It was someone inside, watching me leave. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and I didn't look back. I didn't tell Mark about it. What was there to say? Hey, your silent neighbor, the one in the empty house, was watching me the whole time? He wouldn't believe it, or he'd just tell me it was my imagination again. But the feeling of being observed, of driving away from eyes I couldn't quite see, lingered. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that old truck following me, but the road stayed empty. When I finally hit the paved highway and my phone buzzed with service notifications, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made me pull over. I haven't been back to Mark since. He still invites me, says I need to come back and see the fall colors. But I always make an excuse. Some places it's better not to know who lives past the end of the map, and what they do when the roads stop. The silence after a close call can be a comfort, a temporary reprieve. But it's also a void, an empty space where new anxieties can take root. There are other routes, other journeys, that promise only isolation, where the only company you'll find is the creeping dread of being truly alone. The small metal flag on the mailbox was bent perfectly 90 degrees, signaling new mail inside, even though I hadn't delivered to that box in over a week. My summer job was supposed to be easy money, filling in for my cousin on his rural mail route while he recovered from a minor surgery. It was a temporary gig just for a month, and I figured it would mostly involve listening to podcasts and tossing envelopes into boxes. What I didn't realize was that rural meant miles past where paved roads ended, into a network of dirt tracks and driveways that felt more like goat paths. The kind of place where people lived deliberately off the grid, and frankly, I was starting to understand why. Most days were uneventful, just the hum of the old USPS Jeep and the occasional wave from a porch. But there was one particular stretch, maybe 15 miles out of the nearest town, that always felt different. It was a long, winding gravel road that eventually forked into several unmarked lanes. My cousin had drawn me a crude map on a napkin, heavily annotating this part. He'd warned me, never take the far right turn. It's not on the route, no one lives down there anymore. Just don't. The way he'd said anymore had stuck with me even then, like there was a story there he wasn't telling. One Tuesday, I noticed something new. At the mouth of that forbidden far right lane, a small, unpainted wooden mailbox had appeared. It looked rough, like someone had hammered it together from scrap wood. No name, no number, just a box. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued, but then remembered my cousin's warning and kept driving. It probably belonged to a new hunting camp, or some kids messing around. Nothing to worry about. The next day, it was still there. And the day after that, too. Each time I passed, I felt a strange pull, a tiny itch in the back of my mind telling me to just take a quick peek down that lane. On Friday, when I reached that fork, the little wooden box had a red flag up. Someone had mail for me to pick up. My stomach did a weird flip. I knew I shouldn't, but the mail carrier in me, even the temporary one, couldn't ignore a flagged box. I pulled the Jeep over, the engine ticking, and walked over. The box was empty except for a single, thick envelope. No stamp, no return address, just a handwritten name on the front. To the new carrier. My hands felt a little sweaty as I opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper folded in half. The note was written in neat, almost artistic cursive. It read, "Welcome to the route. We've been watching you. You're doing a good job. We have some packages for you to take back for us. Come down the lane tomorrow. We'll be waiting." There was no signature, just that. The air felt colder instantly. "We've been watching you." The words echoed. Who were we? And what kind of packages? I glanced down the lane. It was overgrown, dark, and disappeared quickly into dense woods. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, certainly not by anyone who was waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sounded amplified. I tried to rationalize it. Prank, maybe. Some locals messing with the new guy. It had to be. But the way the note was phrased, the calm certainty of it, unnerved me. The next morning, I tried to call my cousin, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I didn't want to go, but the thought of leaving those packages behind, and what that might imply to whoever sent the note, felt worse than facing whatever was down there. So, with a pounding heart, I started my route, heading for that fork in the road. When I reached the turn, I took a deep breath and turned right, driving slowly down the lane my cousin had warned me about. The branches scraped against the Jeep, and the track narrowed quickly. After about a quarter mile, the trees opened up slightly, revealing a clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, dilapidated shack, half hidden by vines. It looked abandoned, long past any habitation. No movement, no sign of life. Just the shack, a few rusted farm implements, and the overwhelming silence of the woods. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Where were they? Where were the packages? I considered just turning around, but then I saw it. On the shack's rickety front porch, half obscured by a drooping tarp, was an old wooden swing. And on that swing, neatly lined up, were 3 identical, small, rough-hewn wooden boxes. Not packages, but small, handmade boxes like the mailbox itself. They looked like miniature coffins. My blood ran cold. There was no one around, no car, no sound. Just those 3 boxes, waiting. I couldn't bring myself to get out of the Jeep. I couldn't even look at them for long. A sudden, primal fear seized me, urging me to just leave. I slammed the Jeep into reverse, spinning it around in a tight arc, and sped back down the lane, the branches whipping past my windows. I didn't stop until I was back on the main gravel road, and even then, I floored it all the way back to paved roads. I quit the mail route that day. I told my cousin I had a family emergency. I never mentioned the note or the boxes. A few weeks later, when he was back on his feet, I asked him casually about that far-right lane. He just shook his head, a strange look in his eyes. No one lives down there, not since the Graysons. Well, they just disappeared one day, decades ago. Their house just fell apart. No one ever got mail down there. I still think about those 3 small, empty wooden boxes, and wonder who they were meant for. These stories, they're not just about abandoned roads or isolated houses. They're about the quiet anxieties that can creep in when the familiar falls away, about the spaces where logic dissolves and the human mind is left to grapple with the unknown. They linger because they tap into that primal fear of being lost, of being forgotten, and of what might find us when we are. If you want more journeys into the unsettling, consider joining us for a new story every week.